I was asked to review the purpose of the committee, and here's what it says on the Great Connect website that the city has put together for this. It is tasked with advising the mayor and council on potential ballot measures for the November 2026 election, subject to the overarching parameters discussed by the mayor and council: fire, police, aircraft rescue and firefighting, and emergency management. So hopefully that addresses, there were some concerns or some questions about that previously. We're going to start now with Brian Gall.
We'll go.
And he's going to talk about the Flagstaff Airport. That'll be an interesting presentation. Welcome everyone online.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian Gall, Director of the Flagstaff Airport. We joined up here as part of the presentation today by Tim Skinner, who's the Aircraft Rescue and Firefighting Battalion Chief and Airport Operations Manager at the Flagstaff Airport. Our presentation today is roughly broken down into 4 major parts. Part 1 being some background information about the airport. Part 2 being some specific details about aircraft rescue and firefighting and airport operations. Those two kind of go hand in hand under our current model. 3 is going to be our request for some additional funding that we wanted to be considered by this committee, and then we're going to have some time for discussion at the end. Our intent is to leave 20 to 30 minutes toward the end of this meeting to make sure we have a good opportunity to answer any questions, or especially those kind of big picture questions that might come up at the end. But if anybody has questions about the stuff we're talking about or wants a clarification on a slide, please don't hesitate to stop us and ask that during the presentation. Starting us off with some background information. So first, some general history on the Flagstaff Airport. The airport was originally constructed in 1948 for less than $50,000. So overall, I think we're doing pretty well on our return on initial investment, at least. It is actually the 3rd airport in the Flagstaff area. The original one was actually roughly where Flag High is, and then there was one out in Doney Park before moving to this location in 1948. The airport is owned and operated by the city of Flagstaff. This was classified by the Federal Aviation Administration as a non-hub primary commercial service airport. It's kind of a long way of saying a regional airport. It has to do with the number of passenger enplanements we have every year, but typically airports that have regional airport in their name are in that category. As an airport, we're actually ranked 252nd out of 562 commercial service airports in the country. So squarely in that upper half of traffic from a commercial standpoint. Our current traffic right now, our current commercial service right now is provided by American Airlines with daily direct flights to both Phoenix and Dallas-Fort Worth. Our airfield elevation is 7,014 feet, which actually makes us the 6th highest commercial service airport in the country. That adds to its operational challenges. That's some of the things that Tim will touch on later, but it does make us fairly unique amongst our peers in the commercial service market. We're also the closest commercial service airport to both the Grand Canyon and Sedona. Tourism actually drives a bulk of our traffic. About 60% of our enplanements are by visitors, with 40% being from local traffic. And we do get about over 90 inches of snow annually over the last 20 years, with of course some higher amounts in there. 163 inches in the 22-23 season and 108 inches in the 24 season. Not so much this year, but hopefully we'll catch up. So in terms of personnel, as I mentioned, the airport is owned and operated by the city of Flagstaff. You'll see a lot of employees there, but most of them don't work for the airport. Generally, employees you see around airports work for the businesses that lease space at the airport. So in terms of city staff that work at the airport, we have 14 airport employees. There's 4 of us in the airport administrative office and 10 staff members that are part of the aircraft rescue and firefighting and airport operations team. That's a joint team. We do also have 2 to 3 assigned Flagstaff police officers at the airport terminal, though they are police employees rather than airport employees. It actually puts us quite a bit below some of our peer regional airports. So if you look in the Four Corners area, what some other airports have, St. George Regional, for example, has 16 employees in that ARF operations position compared to our 10. Durango, La Plata County, and Southwest Colorado has 11 aircraft rescue and firefighting and airport operations employees, plus an additional 8 operations and maintenance workers that perform similar functions. And then Yuma International Airport, which actually has the closest number of passenger enplanements to us. They're actually co-located with a Marine Corps air station, so their aircraft rescue and firefighting services are provided by the military, but they still have 6 airport operations employees and 9 airport maintenance workers. So that that small group of people operates a pretty extensive fleet of equipment, starting especially with today's conversation with our ARF equipment, ARF apparatus. We have 3 frontline ARF trucks. Tim will talk more about those later. 2 of them are in a frontline role and 1 of them is in a reserve role. We also have 1 battalion chief based at the airport. That's Tim's position, that has their own vehicle. We have 8 pieces of snow removal equipment. It seems funny to be talking about snow in a public safety presentation, but that team actually does both. And Tim's going to go into how that system works the way it's currently set up. We also have tractors and mowers and sweepers to remove debris from the airfield and various operations and administrative vehicles. So a lot of folks who have been to the airport, I think it's very easy to think of the airline as the primary tenant. And in many ways, that's true. So our primary tenant at the airport from a commercial service standpoint is American Airlines and their contracted air carrier, which is SkyWest Airlines. So sometimes you'll see SkyWest branded planes at the airport. That's because they have a contract with American Airlines to operate those aircraft to markets like Flagstaff. But they're not the only tenant. So we do have a number of different operators at Flagstaff. Guardian Air is one of our major aircraft operators. They provide air medical transport on behalf of Northern Arizona Healthcare. They have a pretty large base at Flagstaff. It includes at least 2 based aircraft, and they also conduct a lot of maintenance on other aircraft that are visiting from other airports in the region. We also have the Arizona Department of Public Safety, which has 2 law enforcement and rescue helicopters based at the airport. We have Empire Airlines, which is a subsidiary of FedEx that flies air cargo into Flagstaff. Similarly, a company called South Aero flies air cargo on behalf of UPS to the airport. We have 7 car rental companies in the airport terminal, which makes us, as far as I know, the largest single site car rental place in Northern Arizona. We have a business park off of Shamrock Boulevard with a number of different technology and development based businesses in it, as well as a Swift Travel Center gas station. We also have a number of what we call general aviation. So think of the general aviation as sort of a catch-all for all of the non-commercial aircraft operators. So anybody who has a private aircraft, anybody who operates an aircraft for, say, a smaller business would generally be in that small or in that general aviation category. The airport itself has storage space for about 100 general aviation aircraft, and we have a wait list of more than 80 names on it. So a lot of people trying to bring their planes into Flagstaff. And then in addition to the based aircraft, we also get a lot of transient aircraft, so visitors, both charters, commercials, but also diverted flights, so flights that might have an in-flight emergency between destinations that need a place to stop, or aircraft coming in with emergencies. We are open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year to any aircraft that needs an airfield to land. So in terms of aircraft operations, so operations it's a term that's going to come up a lot because there's a lot of meanings in the airport industry. In this particular case, aircraft operations refers to a takeoff or a landing, a movement of aircraft on the airfield, if you want to think of it that way. We average about 120 aircraft operations per day, roughly 40,000 a year. We're seeing what the industry refers to as upgauging, which is increasingly larger aircraft. The airline industry especially has dealt with pilot shortages. So as a result, we start to see more seats assigned to the same number of pilots. So whereas pilots might have flown 35-seat aircraft 15 years ago and 50-seat aircraft 10 or 5 or 10 years ago, now we're seeing the commercial flights into Flagstaff are 65 seats and sort of trending upwards. But we see that also in the general aviation side and the corporate side. For example, that aircraft in the lower right corner is a private equivalent of the same aircraft that American Airlines and SkyWest fly into Flagstaff. So we're sort of seeing that upgauging of the fleet across the board. So we do get those commercial flights. We also get large military aircraft coming in. That picture up there is from earlier this past month in December. That's what they call a C-17. It's a very large military cargo plane. You can kind of tell that's a very large fuel truck underneath its wing there. So it's a very, very large aircraft that comes in. We also get wildland firefighting aircraft, medevac aircraft, similar to Guardian Air Transport, but also transient ones. So other medevac providers that might be bringing passengers or patients in Northern Arizona Healthcare, they might need a place to fuel before heading back to whatever their origin city was. We get a number of charters, and as I mentioned, general aviation, but that's general aviation that may not be based in Flagstaff, so folks that are coming to visit for any number of reasons. So for commercial traffic, we track how busy we are in terms of what they call enplanements. So an enplanement is a paid passenger boarding an aircraft. So you can see we've had a little bit of a roller coaster over the past 10 years or so. Prior to 2019, we had American Airlines with service to Phoenix. That was our only destination at the time. And we hovered right around 65,000 enplanements for a number of years. In 2019, United Airlines added their service to Denver. American Airlines added their service to Dallas. We jumped way up to over 120,000 enplanements, and then immediately followed that a few months later with COVID, which caused it to sort of crash back down to where it was before. before spiking right back up 400,000 again. And then unfortunately, United Airlines, as a result of that pilot shortage, suspended their service to Flagstaff. So there's a little bit of a roller coaster there, but the trend I wanted to point to today was that if you sort of flatten all that out in the middle and just look at where we were in 2018 to where we are today, we've had a 22% increase in employments. So we're still trending upwards, even though there's a lot of peaks and valleys in between. 2025 is up about 4.5% over where we were in 2024. The final numbers don't come out until September, but that's where we're trending with the year-to-date data. And staff, of course, are working always on securing additional air service. So I think that the potential for that number to keep climbing at a steady rate is very much there, and a big jump is, I think, a very likely possibility in the future. In terms of economic benefit of the airport, so a lot of this references a 2021 ADOT Aeronautics study on economic impact of aviation in the state with a deep dive into a lot of different airports. There is a link to that study if ever anybody wanted to read the details. But some of the big picture notes that I had where there was roughly $69 million in direct economic impact from the Flagstaff Airport. That's roughly $36 million in on-airport commercial activities and $33 million in visitor spending for folks who came to the region through the Flagstaff Airport. We generate about $60 million in induced or indirect economic impact for a total of about $129 million in total economic activity. That also supports 971 jobs. All those businesses I mentioned at the airport and all the facilities that are available at the airport support that. With about $45 million in total employee compensation for folks that are working at the airport. And then that also comes back in the form of about $7.6 million in both local and state tax revenue. But one important thing to note about this is that the airport doesn't necessarily see this revenue, right? So I'll talk a little bit about where the airport's revenue comes from, but it's not necessarily from all of the economic activity on there. So a lot of what we mentioned here hits local businesses. It can hit local and state government through those taxes, but it doesn't necessarily come directly back to the airport. So in terms of the airport budget, the airport is an enterprise fund, meaning our goal is to be financially self-sufficient. Our ongoing revenue sources are things like our leases. I mentioned those private hangars and aircraft storage spaces we rent, plus space for all the businesses that operate there and businesses in our tech park. We also have license agreements for businesses that operate at the terminal that maybe don't need as much space. We do have user fees, so parking fees, for example, fees we charge for our security badges, fees we charge as a commercial aircraft just to land at Flagstaff, all come as our revenue sources. We also get a number of federal and state grants as one-time revenue sources. But I did want to point out that those federal and state grants are generally for capital improvements rather than operating costs. So we tend to see a lot of support from the Federal Aviation Administration in terms of major capital projects, major infrastructure, things like runway repairs, or runway rehabilitation, sort of like major projects, and less so on the operations and maintenance side. From a maintenance standpoint, so the airport does have pretty significant maintenance needs. I like to include this photo here because I think it shows sort of how large the infrastructure is at airports. So that's one of our airport admin vehicles next to the pavement markings on the runway. They might not look that big when you're sitting in a commercial flight, but our runway is about as wide as a 16-lane freeway. So it is a lot of pavement. If you look at just total pavement area on the airport compared to the city of Flagstaff, we have about 10% of the total pavement that the city of Flagstaff Streets Department is in charge of taking care of in the rest of the city. So it is a pretty significant amount of infrastructure. Similarly, from a building standpoint, we have the airport terminal.
We have a question.
Great.
Dorothy, you have a question?
Yes, this is Dorothy Gishi. I'm asking. I raised my hand to ask about what kind of revenue stream you get from charging for the parking lots there on the ground.
Yeah, great question. So that's included in those fees. Our average annual parking revenue, it varies from year to year. We are seeing an increase. I think this year we're looking at $600,000 in parking revenue.
Are there complaints about the change in that? I haven't been to the airport in a long time, and I think about 6 months ago I went over there to pick up an individual, and I saw all the parking changes to the parking lot. So I'm just asking if there was a public outcry about that.
You know, on the initial rollout, which happened before my time at the city, but looking back at the sort of the social media and public comment records that came with the council discussions about that, we did see some concerns that were brought up by citizens. I will say since we implemented it, which was in 2023, the feedback's actually been really positive. Folks who flew out of the
Ah.
air might have experienced what it was like when we only had a single parking lot and parking was free. Roughly 120% of the spaces had cars in them, meaning the spaces plus the landscaping, plus the nearby forest, and sometimes the street. So, well, parking was free. It wasn't necessarily convenient. And so that was one of the major parts that drove us to adding that parking fee so we could afford to add a second parking lot, which more than doubled the city. So I've actually had a number of passengers come up to our office and thank us for implementing the pay parking program, because now folks can drive up, very quickly find a parking space and make their flight without any kind of hassle. I'm sure there are some folks that still have some concerns about it. One of the things we've done is try to keep our parking rates very low, especially compared to our peer airports. For example, our weekly rate is roughly the same as the daily rate in some of the Sky Harbor parking garages. So we tried to keep it, while we tried to make some revenue back from our parking, we tried to keep it cheap enough that it still competes very well with other airports. Did that answer your question, Dorothy?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So in terms of structures from our maintenance standpoint, we have the airport terminal itself, which is coming up, it's actually just over 30 years old, so starting to show its age in a few places. We have done quite a bit of maintenance work on it in the past few years, but that's an ongoing need. Also, the aircraft rescue and firefighting station, which Tim's going to talk a little bit more about. It's the firefighting station plus airport operations building that's occupied 365 days a year. And then we do have roughly those 100 aircraft storage units on the airfield that the airport is responsible for taking care of. In terms of budget, so this is a little bit of a deeper dive into some of what we were talking about with parking. If you look at the graph on the right, or on the left, excuse me, this is what Heidi Derryberry shared in the financial slides a little while ago. So this is sort of a broad look at the airport fund revenues, excluding intergovernmental funds. I'm going to walk over here so I can see the numbers a little better so I don't mess them up. But essentially what you can see is from all those different funding sources we talked about. So that's the charges that we get from some of our tenants, maybe things that are not directly related to rent. For example, we get a percentage of the revenue from rental cars at the airport for rents directly for the businesses that operate in the terminal. For things like passenger facility charges, which is a small fee that's tacked on to air passenger tickets in certain circumstances, our parking rates, investments, things like that. Our total airport revenue is about $2.9 million. This was in FY 25-26. But if you look at our airport operating and maintenance budget, again, in FY 25-26, we saw our total budget that year was about $4.5 million, 4.5 to 4.6 million. So there's a bit of a delta there between our operating budget and our revenue that we're generating at the airport. Looking at how that breaks down into more of what we're talking about today with those ARF and public safety needs, about 1.3 million of our budget goes to the aircraft rescue and firefighting, and about 350,000 of it goes to law enforcement at the airport. So breaking that down a little bit further, you're kind of wondering, how did we operate if our revenue wasn't making up for all of our operating costs? Well, that's through fund transfers from other city entities. So in our case, we got about 1.5 million from the general fund last year to help us fund the shortfall that we had from our revenue to our operating budget. Now that's a particularly high year because we had some sort of emergency capital and maintenance needs that came up from an FAA inspection. Added quite a bit more to that than our average year. We want to provide a snapshot of that most recent fiscal year. We're going to go a little bit more into detail on this later on, but so this is just roughly kind of a big picture overview of the airport's total operating budget, plus the portion of that the aircraft rescue and firefighting and law enforcement affect in that operating budget. In terms of budget challenges, we are, as I mentioned, seeing some shortfalls in that the airport has not historically been financially self-sufficient. While our goal is to be an enterprise fund, we really have never consistently gotten there. And that's actually not unusual for airports this size. Airports like Phoenix Sky Harbor, for example, do a really good job of generating enough revenue to support their entire operations. Regional airports, it's much more hit or miss. I would say it's actually the exception rather than the rule that they're fully financially self-sufficient. It's our goal to get there, or at least as close as we can. From some of the challenges we're seeing with our current budget, maintenance is a big one. So we currently have 30 plus unfunded major maintenance projects with a total outstanding unfunded need of over $4.5 million. We're also seeing an increasing vehicle age. The fire department, I think, talked about a little bit about this in their presentation. Our average fleet age, or vehicle in our fleet, is getting over 20 years old. In fact, our reserve ARF truck is a 1989. So it's that initial grant investment on that vehicle. challenges with staffing levels. As you saw, our staffing levels didn't quite keep up with some of our peer airports. We're also seeing an increasing number of federally mandated programs. So our aircraft rescue and firefighting program is a federally mandated program that has a minimum requirement that goes along with it. Law enforcement is a program that has minimum requirements from the Department of Homeland Security that we have to meet. Even things like an airport civil rights program, we have to maintain a civil rights and disadvantaged business enterprise program. It will take staff time to track. So a number of federally mandated programs increase and does add to our operating costs to try to get there. Additionally, we've seen a reduction in some of the grant funding support available. For example, there used to be a program that helped airports provide that mandatory law enforcement presence at airport terminals through some Department of Homeland Security funding. The program went away due to budgetary constraints a few years ago. We are trying to fight to get it back along with some other airports, but it seems like it's going to be a pretty heavy lift. So that's an additional revenue source, grant revenue source that we used to have that we no longer have. And on the state level, the state aviation fund, which is where a lot of things like aviation fuel taxes go, is swept a number of times by the state legislature as part of their budget process. It's not protected like other funds might be, like the Highway User Revenue Fund. So unfortunately, funding has been diverted out of that to other needs in the state rather than to airport. In terms of revenue opportunities, we are looking for ways to increase our revenue. Number one, of course, being grant funding. We're always looking for those state and federal funding opportunities through grants. Parking revenue, which is one we already talked about. We recently raised our parking rates to sort of keep pace with our parking operating costs in other airports in the region. We propose development across the airport, including things that are not necessarily aviation related. There is some airport property across J.W. Powell Boulevard that is, we entered an agreement with a company to develop a technology park. We're looking into adding additional private hangars that are to capture some of those folks on that aircraft wait list and get ground leases to operate those hangars. We've recently added more terminal concessions that are bringing some of the revenue we get from food sales in the terminal. And of course, we're always looking at adding some user fees. I mentioned badging, that's a new fee. Traditionally, we didn't charge for security badges at the airport, but it's something we're adding this year. Big takeaway though is that some of those funding sources are going to take a number of years to develop. The tech park, for example, is going to take a while to come into effect before we see any revenue from that. Similarly with the private hangars, those are probably 5 to 10 year efforts. And even if you can add up all these, it still leaves us with a budget shortfall. Now, in terms of public safety staffing history at the airport, I mentioned aircraft rescue and firefighting. So aircraft rescue and firefighting, which Tim's going to go into a lot more detail on that program in some future slides. But historically, aircraft rescue and firefighting, or ARF is what its acronym is, was treated as sort of a subset of airport operations and maintenance. So the ARF trucks were kind of a giant fire extinguisher that airport maintenance workers knew how to use in the event that there was ever any kind of fire on the airport. Unfortunately, the industry learned some very hard lessons from some air disasters over the years, and the conditions, the minimum requirements of that program have continually increased since then, to where now it really is a standalone need at airports. The minimum requirements of the, oops, I'm sorry, I think I might have skipped one. I jumped ahead a slide. So from a law enforcement staffing history at the airport, the minimum staffing is set by the Department of Homeland Security. Prior to 2010, the airport operations team provided security at the airport, but they weren't really trained or prepared with equipment on any kind of security thing other than standing there with a radio. So about that time, we started to see more TSA requirements come in. We started adding Flagstaff police officers in the airport terminal. Those were the ones that were funded through some of that grant support from the Department of Homeland Security. As I mentioned, since then, that funding has dried up, but our Flagstaff police officers are still there at the airport for departing flights, which is when they're required to be there by the TSA. Outside of that, the coverage is more sporadic. So we do a really good job of providing that coverage for any of those departing passengers anytime that TSA checkpoint is open. But outside of that, there's a little bit of a gap that we would like to talk about filling today. Now on a aircraft rescue and firefighting standpoint, that was what I was referring to about ARF was formerly sort of a subset of airport maintenance work. The Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, sets the minimum ARF standards through what we call the ARF index. And that's based on the size of the largest sort of regular commercial service aircraft you see. So pre-2019, we were what they refer to as ARF Index A. That was set by the aircraft in the upper right here. So 2 turboprop aircraft set about 35 people or so. There were some earlier model commercial jets at Flagstaff that replaced it, but roughly the same seating capacity. Under 50 seats was the big takeaway from that. At the time, we had 7 ARF staff with a minimum on-duty staffing of 1. So at any given time, we had 1 person available to respond in that fire truck in case of an emergency. Staffing was also not 24-hour hours per day. It was roughly 18 to 19 hours per day, centered on those commercial flights. Now, I mentioned upgauging before, as we start to see these larger and larger aircraft. Well, one of the consequences operationally of upgauging is that as planes get bigger, flight schedules stretch out. So if American Airlines wants to get passengers from Flagstaff to, say, Dallas to connect to flights, well, because they're only having one flight a day, potentially, or two flights a day on these larger aircraft, they're going to send them early in the morning. So people are going to have to leave super early to get there so they can have a whole menu of connecting options available when they get to their connecting airport. And then the inverse is true coming back. So they only have one arriving flight from Dallas to Flagstaff coming. They're going to wait till the very end of the day so they can capture as many passengers as possible that need to get to a city like Flagstaff. As a result, though, that stretches out the day when we needed to have the ARF team on site to support those commercial operations. So from 2019 to the present, we moved up to what they call ARF Index B, which means the regional jet that we currently have is a CRJ 700. They seat 65 passengers, which moved our ARF staff to 10 with a minimum staffing of 2. At any given time, we have 2 persons able to respond on 2 fire trucks to any emergency. So 1 person per truck. That's 24 hours per day. And again, we do have those 2 trucks in service. And Tim's going to go into a lot more detail on how that response model works in actually part 2. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tim, who's going to go into some detail on what aircraft rescue and firefighting and airport operations looks like here at Flagstaff.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Skinner. Like Brian said, I'm the ARF Battalion Chief. I'm also the Airport Operations Manager. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about aircraft rescue firefighting, and we're going to touch on the airport operations. Wanted to kind of preface this with saying that we understand this is a public safety presentation, and what we're going to do is really illustrate what we feel are real critical needs out there and some of the gaps that we have. In order to do that, we need to talk about airport operations. You'll see that's one of the big issues that we have that's going to cause a lot of challenges to go forward. So to get started, I kind of want to talk about what ARP is, aircraft rescue firefighting, exactly what it sounds like. It's a specialized form of firefighting, typically managed by a fire department, focuses on the emergency response to aviation incidents for the protection of life and preservation of property. It's also responsible for airport emergencies involving structures like hangars, buildings, hazardous materials, fuel farms. We'll get into that in a little bit. Rescue operations and emergency medical services. Like Brian mentioned, ARF is heavily regulated by the FAA. And there's a bunch of stringent requirements on there. Not only have we seen in the past, but we're also seeing the increased complexity, which is going to be a theme we see throughout here. Those federal requirements include specialized training facilities that are located throughout the nation. Typically, right now, we're going to the Dallas-Fort Worth Fire Training Research Center. Excellent choice. In addition to, we have to do reoccurring training throughout the year. Also, we also have to do something called a live fire burn once every year. So, and I'll get into some of the initial training, but when we get someone out of an academy, we'll send them to an ARF school, get them back, send them through a 4-week airport ops academy, and so kind of list more in detail later. And then sometime in the next 12 months, we have to send that individual back to a certified training facility as well. So that's on the federal side of the house. On the regional or national standard side of the house, the National Fire Protection Association, not agency, dictates that in order to be an aircraft rescue firefighter, you have to meet all the qualifications of a structure firefighter. So this is where we start to kind of see a little bit of this second challenge or issue that we have out here that's causing a bunch of issues. And so to kind of expand on that, what we do right now, in fact, we just finished up a process today. We have our aircraft rescue firefighters have to meet all the same minimum requirements as a Flagstaff firefighter. We do a joint hiring process, which we'll get into a little bit. They have to go through a 11-week GFR training. After that, they focus on, we talked about that specialized 40-hour ARF school. After that, they come back in-house, and we put them through a 4-week combination of continuing ARF Academy and start branching into that airport operations. So long story short, there's an extensive amount of training and specialization that goes into that. A couple of the differences or specialization part of the aircraft rescue firefighting stuff is the knowledge, skills, abilities, and specialized equipment that we have to use. You see, I already seen a couple of pictures that Brian talked about. Our fire trucks are green. That's kind of going down a rabbit hole. That's because they're federally funded. If we could afford to pay for our own ARF trucks, we could make them red like standard fire trucks. But they have specialized extinguishing agents on there too. So we have to obviously be very familiar with not only those types of extinguishing agents, but how to apply them during certain emergencies. And then firefighters also have to be very familiarized with different aircraft system, whether that's fuel types, evacuation routes, and shutdown procedures. So going forward, if you look on this screen, and I apologize for the small print, it's the best we could do on this. So we have a lot of comparisons here to the fire department, and kind of going from right to left to right. Again, we already talked about there's the same minimum requirements to even get hired on. So we have firefighter 1 and 2, emergency medical technician. After that, we send them to an 11-week same GFR academy. We also have the same shifts. They're on the same pay plan with a couple exceptions. I'll talk about that here in a little bit. Same retirement. They do almost the exact same. And I'm looking at Chief Wilson back there, kind of like that. Almost the exact same programming work. In addition to the reoccurring ARC training, they also do the reoccurring structure and GFR training. Physical fitness is a requirement, just like the fire department. They do station maintenance and apparatus maintenance. The same thing, they have the same schedule. It's a 24-hour, 4896. So they live there. That's their house, their home. We also do public education. We'll talk about a little bit all these more in detail. What we're going to consider an all hazard emergency response. They do prevention. And that's kind of about where, again, where we kind of stop with the similarities, which you'll see there's a lot more green, and there's going to be a theme with this going forward. The real difference is for our firefighters, there's 3 big differences that are caused by this separation. That's span of control, our minimum staffing, and some rank. We'll talk about that. On the flip side, and this might help answer some questions here shortly, is the fire department does not have the ARF certification, and they don't have to perform the airport operations. So a little bit of our structure overview right now. We have, again, a lot of the stuff I talked about, the program work especially, and even the incident response. Clearly, we're in no means in competition as far as call volume goes with the folks in town, not even necessarily fraction. But there's still, obviously, it's comparable. Same thing with the stations. We only have 1 station at the airport. There's Station 10's a wildland station. We'll leave that later. There's only 1 ARF station at the airport. That's the fire station number 9. It's broken down into myself, a 40-hour battalion chief, again, also the airport operations manager. We have a total of, when we're fully staffed, we have a total of 9 ARF firefighters and are also operational specialists. Those 9 are broken down into 2 different ranks. ARF leads, which is the comparable to an fire captain. And then we have 6 firefighters who drive and operate the ARF trucks, which is kind of comparative to the engineer role. We'll kind of get to that in a little bit. Like Brian mentioned, we have 2 frontline trucks, and then we also have a reserve truck, which again, just to reiterate, is a 19. Shifts are the same, not only the schedule, the hours wise, that they're broken up into 3 different shifts, A, B, and C shift. And so 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so looking at the graphic on the right, here's where we start to see some of the causes of these issues is the organizational chart. We tried to make this a little bit more, I guess, obvious really, but if to do that, it'd probably take up both screens. But basically what you're looking at is we have 1 40-hour supervisor and we have 9 direct reports to that supervisor with 2 different ranks. So think of it more of like a pancake, right? If you remember some of the slides from the fire department, it's a little bit different where they had a kind of a 3 or 4 tier rank system: firefighter, engineer, captain, battalion chief, and so on. What this does is exceeds a realistic span of control, which is typically going to be that 3 to 5, I believe, instead of that 9. Becomes a big challenge when we're trying to accomplish all the tasks that we're going to try and do that we need to do out there. Such as kind of overview, kind of more detail of what we're doing. Again, obviously, so emergency response, we talked about kind of an all hazard emergency response. If there's anything that happens inside the airport, inside the fence with the airport, we're going to go to that. We also, with that, whenever we can, we try and help out our partners, the Flagstaff Fire Department and the other GFR partners. Some sort of off-duty recall. A couple examples of this is we were fortunate enough to get a few folks in during the tunnel fire, some folks that were wildland trained, get them into town and kind of help backfill for that. We've also had situations to where we had a semi-tanker fire. I forget how many years ago that was, Chief, 4 or 5 something. A semi-trailer full of fuel crashed underneath the Butler overpass, caught on fire. We were able to provide an ARC unit and a firefighter for assistance on that. Most recently, in a logistical sort, there was a 2 alarm fire down in Highlands. It was 3 structures involved. We were able to support with some spare SCBA bottles. So again, when we can, which is not often, we try and help out as well. Typically, we'll see a lot of this help a little bit more frequently at the command level, like my level. Also, again, same thing. We do reports and record keeping. The record keeping on the federal aviation side of the house is very stringent. We get inspected at least once a year. It could also be a surprise inspection, but at least once a year. And record keeping is a very critical component of this compliance, not only on the ARF side, but on the airport operations side. And then obviously the report writing, which is another similarity to, for incidents, we do all our reports. It's the same reporting the software system that the fire department uses. We also use the same payroll telestaff system that the fire department uses. We talked about apparatus and station maintenance. Again, these folks live there just like the fire department. I'm sure you guys know what a firehouse, or can imagine what it is. They live there, they take care of it, they weed eat, they change light bulbs, they clean, they do all that other stuff. Also, stringent training we talked about on the specialization side of the house. There's also the training associated with the regular fire side of the house. In addition to, and we'll get into that in a little bit, a couple other sides, is the airport operations side. So there's a bunch of different training and all that. It's also the same physical fitness requirement. So same on that work. Program work, a little bit more kind of with that. Again, similar program work. We're looking from the fire side of the house. We're talking about things like SCBAs, PPE, radios, EMS supplies, health and wellness stuff. We also see a lot of program work, which again, I'll explain on another slide, on the airport operations side of the house. We also do public education, just like a fire department does. The only real big difference is we keep our trucks at the airport. Extenuating circumstances aside, we keep our trucks at the airport. So instead of us going to elementary schools or going out into the public to do some public education, we have the students or the kids come to us. It's a really kind of cool field trip. In addition to that public education, we also do fire extinguisher training for some of our stakeholders on the airport, Wiseman Aviation, the terminal, and we recently started doing some stop the bleed training as well. Outside of that, again, there's a lot of parallels we talked about with the fire department. We also do inspections, took over building inspections, assisted with the fire department on the prevention side with building inspections, hangar inspections, fuel farm inspections. And for those who don't know what a fuel farm is, it's basically a facility that contains a lot of fuel. At the airport, we have roughly a little over 50,000 gallons of fuel at any given time, spread out against 4 different locations. We're responsible for inspecting those and making sure they're up to compliance. We also staff up for things, for special events similar to the fire department. So things like we have an open house called Thunder Over Flag. That we help out as best we can, help staff up with that too. We also have VIP visits, so that's where we tie in a lot with our partners with the fire or with the police department, some political figures, and then we have some increased coverage when we can upon request for some of those large military aircraft that Brian talked about. So with that, they do all of that. And again, this is kind of where we get into the real big part of this, or some of the challenges with it. All of that fire stuff, right? Again, all that requirement, all that training, all that mandates on one aspect. And we also do something called airport operations. This is where I don't want to lose you, but again, this is where we really get into some of the meat and potatoes of why some of the challenges we have out here. Airport operations, and Brian, please jump in. Airport operations is basically the compliance aspect of a commercial airport. And so you'll see this entire list in front of your screen or up on the screen over here. It's not an all-inclusive list. This is just kind of some of the highlights on here. And so things like airfield inspections, airfield maintenance, snow removal, wildlife hazard, security and access control, notice to air emissions, we'll get into that. These are all very kind of in-depth programs, if this makes sense. So typically with a lot of these, we'll see associated plans. So for example, we have a snow and ice control plan. We have a wildlife hazard management plan. We actually have an airfield lighting and markings plan. And so maybe looking at first glance could see that, it's probably easy for firefighters to do this when they're not busy, especially at a low call volume place like an ARF station. It's not that simple. So for example, we talked about firefighters doing maintenance on the station, so changing light bulbs. Up until actually very recently, we found out that changing light bulbs on an airfield is really not that simple. There's actually a lot that goes into it. In fact, so much so that it's actually very, very, very dangerous. And a lot of airports actually have specialized airfield electricians on staff. And so we're actually going through a training part right now just to figure out, just to get our folks the safety to accurately shut those down. We're also seeing, Brian talked about the increase in the federal programs or the federal regulations as well. There's also increase in the numbers. We're also seeing an increase in complexity. One of those, for example, the airfield inspections or the daily inspections is what we call. We're seeing this is this is not as simple as just taking a vehicle and driving out, going down the runway really quick and coming back to the station. It's actually a very all-inclusive inspection list for the safe operation of the airport. We're seeing that, we'll talk about some staffing challenges later, and what this kind of affects is that we are seeing increasing discrepancies, but we're seeing consistencies and discrepancies annually when we get our inspection. They basically want to see us be doing more and more thorough inspections, as one example. And then, like Brian mentioned, 6 snowiest airport, highest airport.
6 highest.
We're gonna call it 6. So snow, just like what we got going on outside. So snow removal is obviously a big issue here. Scott, I know you guys do this as well. This becomes a real big challenge. This was one of those examples of increased complexity in the federal mandates. In, I want to say 2016, the FAA came out and said, airports are doing snow removal all wrong. It's not safe and you need to do it differently. And so with this, they put on time constraints. They put on equipment requirements. They put on these whole notice to airmen thing. We'll get here in a second. So it's becoming a lot more, continuing to become a lot more involved. Last example, again, is a notice to airmen, or excuse me, a notice to air missions, I forget what they call it now. These are essentially notifications to pilots that they should look up or can look up mid-flight to see what the conditions are at the airport. This is one example to where we, as emergency, we cannot do. We actually got a discrepancy violation on this a few years ago. We had a what we call an alert 3, which is an aircraft crash. And alert 1 is a possible problem with an aircraft. Alert 2 is a problem that could compromise a safe landing, and alert 3 is a crash. We had a crash. Luckily, everybody walked away, but we had a crash. And typically, when you have an alert 3 on the runway, you were supposed to do a bunch of different things from an airport operations side of the house. Issue a notice to air emissions, close down the runway, and if it's an extended closure, put up something called lighted X's, especially if it's going to go into the night. We simply do not have the staff, and at some point we don't have the actual equipment to do that. So we were almost written up for that, so to speak. Again, just kind of, again, really want to spend too much time on this, but to really kind of show this, the complexity as well. And we're more than happy to answer questions or go into a rabbit hole if you guys want on this. You'll see a couple things in there with some red asterisks on there. This is something that we are currently not doing that typical airports across the country do for airport operations wise. So I don't want to say we're not doing a good job at some of the airport operations, but that's kind of the truth. And in some cases, we're not actually doing any of these certain. And then obviously, again, maybe it goes without saying, but the big thing here is the fire doesn't stop. So we don't stop the aircraft rescue firefighting. We don't stop staffing that. We've seen this a lot of times where we have, we see this as aircraft crashes or aircraft emergencies. Again, statistically speaking, commercial aircraft is the safest form of travel. So I don't try and scare you guys. Brian's going to talk a little bit about a very realistic possibility later. Again, they do happen, right? So obviously, like during snow, for example, planes can and do crash sometimes. So obviously, we can't set the fire side of the house down just to pick up the operation side. That's a big takeaway. So what this is really leading to, and again, if it's kind of not obvious already, they're two different jobs. They really are. They have a common theme that they're both on airports, but that's really kind of about where it drops. We have a couple different pictures of examples here, but some of this stuff, it's logistically kind of impossible to do both of them, to try and plan for that. It's mentally exhausting, if not impossible, to try and do both. And in some cases, it's actually physically impossible to do both of these jobs at the same time. For example, we can't drive a fire truck and drive a plow truck at the same time. And so what we've done to try and kind of meet this, and this is kind of goes back to what Brian was talking about, are the growth, and like what the fire department talked about, are outpacing our resources. They're outpacing our needs. And again, it's something that we're seeing just continue. I don't think it's lighting up on that. But to kind of make this work, we've tried to do the best of what we can, where if you can believe it or not, we've actually used one of the fire trucks, which is roughly 2020 numbers, $800,000 piece of equipment, to drive down the runway and do an inspection as best we can. We've also used that same fire truck to try and chase a coyote off the runway. Ever tried to spray a coyote with a water cannon turret? It's a little bit challenging. It's like kind of like an Acme cartoon. We really in the air traffic control towers. We've also seen the opposite side of that house too, where we've had people in snowplow equipment respond to an emergency. We've had people on a mower doing airfield maintenance and a plane crash and jump out and say, "I'm here to help you," and they're covered in weeds. And so you can imagine some of the, again, the challenges associated with that. So, and a lot of this stuff, again, it's not hypothetical. These are situations that happen. This is not something we're trying to get ahead of. This is something we're trying to address that's already happened. And so really what this is, it's, we've talked about this, it's unrealistic expectations. It's unrealistic expectations for the service that we're providing. It's unrealistic expectations for the staff and employees. And so the other thing, what also happens as well, we risk, and we saw this in something we'll talk about on the full scale exercise, if the staff being spread too thin, risk also the response, if this makes sense. And so we'll talk about a situation to where if they choose not to take the fire truck, or if they choose to take a pickup truck and go respond to a wildlife hazard issue, if there's an emergency, they are not able to respond in a timely manner. We have a timed response time for commercial flights. So we have 2 trucks in service, like Brian talked about, 1 firefighter or lead in each truck. First truck has to be on scene and dispensing the agent within 3 minutes. The second has to be there and dispense agents within 4 minutes. And so 500 acres, roughly 800. 800, we'll call it 800. I like 800. I hear 900. 800 acres, and so you can imagine at one given point, any given point, really on the airfield, if someone is out doing required airport operational duties, to try and drive expeditiously back in a vehicle and get in a fire truck and go to that emergency scene, again, is not safe, and it's not a realistic expectation. So, yeah. So with this, we'll see. So because of this combination, which is one of the real big problems we're here to talk to you about, this having the firefighters do 2 different tasks is really overwhelming, and it has gotten to the point to where it's actually impeding on some of the preparation work that the firefighters can do there. This has a really big impact on staff. Brian talked about we were really fortunate enough in 2019. We initially had a minimum staff of 7. That was actually 6 line firefighters. We were fortunate enough in 2019 to get 3 more added because of our index increase. That gave us a lot more room. However, we also doubled our ARF trucks. So we still only have that 1 response, that 1 per truck. And so going back to that 2019 timeframe, we've actually had, when it comes to state hiring, we've had 11 people leave. And so that may not sound like a lot, but out of a full staff of 9 line staff, it's 120% attrition rate. That's insane, in my opinion. But it also comes with a cost going forward of about $30,000 per firefighter, just on the fire side of the house. That's PPE, turnouts, et cetera. That's GFR Academy costs. That does not account for any sort of the ARF training costs, which again, anywhere rough numbers, maybe another 10,000 or so, or any sort of the training costs associated with other staff training. So it's a substantial amount of money. Of those 11 people, again, people leave work for different reasons. We all know that. We were fortunate enough to do a lot of exit interviews with them, and we're finding a very common theme that people are leaving. A couple big reasons here: burnout for the lack of staffing. So going back to, I haven't already talked about it, the 9 staffing that we have, a full staffing is 3 people. Our minimum staffing is 2. And so with which we're constantly more, I don't know if we have numbers on that, but I would say it's the majority of the time, given vacation, time off, sick time, injury leave, all this other stuff, consistent vacancies that we have, we're at minimum staffing more often than I think. And so they've also cited lack of professional development opportunities. We talked about that pancake structure system. There's not a lot of movement for growth in there. And then obviously the big one we talked about, doing the 2 different jobs, they're kind of being pulled different directions. There's not a lot of role clarity. Are they firefighters? We want them to be trained. They spend all this time and money and energy getting trained as professionals, but we also need them to go to airport operations. And so they're kind of like, what do you want from us, right? And so interesting about those 11 people, 8 of those, actually not surprising, have gone to their fire departments. And so with those constant state of hiring, and which is actually ironic because we just finished up a hiring process today. So in theory, we're soon to be back to full staffing. Not to be doom and gloom, but we're looking at another 2 people leaving this year already. So we're going to have a vicious cycle repeat itself. But this adds a lot of strain on current staff. So we have a limited pool of these specialized aircraft rescue firefighters out there. This is where we go back to that one of the checklists for the firefighters that the fire department on top are not certified. This is where you're starting to see some of that impact. And so, which actually ties directly into that bench step that we talked about to cover any sort of time off, excuse me, or staffing emergencies. You can imagine COVID was kind of fun. With the staffing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, Brian's going to jump in. He does a great job with this. So again, going back to the minimum staffing levels, we're going to do an experiment here a little bit to keep you guys awake. So again, minimum staffing is 1 per truck. And so our firefighting, very similar to structure firefighting in a lot of aspects, requires boots on the ground, requires actual physical work, right? When we have 1 person per staff and per truck, that really limits the capabilities of those firefighters in that. And so we have an auto aid on our city fire department, we're also with Highlands Fire Department and Summit Fire Department. But we're looking at, by the time, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, Chief Wilson, by the time they get notification from the tone out, get to the airport, level 1, and get an assignment from an incident commander, we're looking at about 7 minutes before those crews can actually go to work. So Brian's going to talk about this. If you have a passenger, or if you have anybody inside of an aircraft that has crashed and they can't self-extricate, or they're in an ideal age situation, it's going to be 7 minutes before somebody can probably get out there. This is not obviously a good thing. This is obviously a very, can't overstate this, not a good thing. It is not a good thing. Having not, thankfully, in that situation, I've been on the opposite side of the situation in the ARP truck. And I can tell you that 7 minutes, 6 minutes, 5 minutes until someone comes to help back you up or help those people who are waving their arms around saying, help me, it feels like an eternity. And so the staffing level, again, is kind of some of this stuff that we're seeing, again, is a product of some of these issues we have. But minimum staffing that we have is not consistent with local, regional, or national standards. Regional standards for the fire department's minimum staffing is 3 per truck, should be 4, it's 3 per truck right now. And then we have the National Fire Protection Association and the International Civilian Aviation Organization, which is kind of the FAA, a global FAA rule. So they dictate that we should have 9 people, not 9 people total, 9 people per shift. And Brian, you want to talk about the photo real quick?
Yeah, so I just wanted to reiterate a little bit what Tim was talking about. I came to the airport about 5 years ago, and this is what initially shocked me and still is one of those things that keeps us up at night. Right, so as Tim mentioned, when we're at our minimum staffing, 2 personnel, so 1 person per truck, right? 2 trucks arriving to a scene, so just 2 people. That is the response that we have available on an aircraft incident, right? So when we have a commercial aircraft that might crash in a place like Flagstaff, those 2 people are on their own at that accident scene for 7 minutes until those mutual aid responders show up at the site. And that's just by function of the geography of the stations in the Flagstaff area. So this is a screenshot from a video from an aircraft incident that happened in Toronto earlier this year. This is a regional jet that's very similar to what we have in Flagstaff. It was not an announced emergency. It wasn't something they had planned on, that there was already resources staging for it. This is a plane in inclement weather, impacted the runway too hard, and ended up losing a wing that caught fire and drifted away from the aircraft, and the aircraft ended up upside down. Very fortunate that no one was killed in the incident. Right? But as you can see here, this is a regional aircraft upside down. This is a very large pool of jet fuel that's starting to form underneath the aircraft because the fuel is all stored in the wings. As the ARF apparatus start to arrive and they're spraying down that specialized foam that Tim was talking about on those wings to keep that fire from spreading, because it only takes about 90 seconds for fire to burn through an aircraft fuselage into where the passengers are. So their primary role is to keep that fire away from the people so the people can get out safely. You start to see people coming out of the aircraft at the emergency overwing exits, which are now underwing because it's upside down. What you don't have is this person right here, which is the additional ARF personnel that are coming to assist those passengers. Right now, our folks are focused on staying in that truck, and making sure that fire stays away. But for 7 minutes, that's the resources, and those passengers and the air crew are evacuating on their own and figuring out where to go safely on their own until those resources show up. So I just wanted to point that out, that in addition to the snow plowing and the other duties that Tim was talking about from an ARF standpoint, that's why we keep that minimum staff there. But even that minimum staff kind of doesn't put us in a good place where we feel like we should have more resources. We would like to have more resources to respond to that. And as Tim mentioned, that 7 minutes can go for a very long time. So I actually brought a timer because I kind of want to point out in this presentation how long it takes us to get there. I'll bring it back up when we finish this, but it feel like a very long time in this incident like that.
Chief Gaylor brought up a really good point. It said something called IDLH, for those of you who don't know. Danger to life and health.
Immediately dangerous to life and health.
So thank you, Brian, for that. So like Brian talked about, so as an example, is in this video, similar type of aircraft that we service. Brian also referred to something called upsizing or upgauging, excuse me, the aircraft. This is where we see the comparison of what we talked about for the growth with the rest of the city. The fire department talked about increasing in populations, increasing in buildings, and increasing in building size. Airport's seeing something very, very comparable. May not be geographically expanding, but we're seeing larger type of aircraft and more frequent of aircraft. And again, going back to the resources not matching the growth. Larger aircraft for us equals more risk. So kind of hitting back on some of those check marks really quick. We talked about some of the compliance and industry standards. We're seeing that increased demands of airport operations compliance on staff. Getting hammered with that stuff. On the ARP side of the house, we're seeing complexity in the ARP standards as well. A couple examples, we have a new foam system that's coming out that's actually going to require a different type of strategy and tactic on the application of this foam. We also have some different overall strategies and tactics that we're looking at. Another problem with not being associated or managed by a fire department is we talked about those similarities, those programs, those other support systems in there. Fully separation or delegating those functions. So things like the training, admin support, prevention, EMS, it all falls down really to the RPC and trying to get pushed down to some of those lower ranks. Yes.
So my question is if you have to call in a your report, that would be Summit or Highlands?
It would be the Flagstaff Fire Department and Highlands. The Summit Fire Department is part of the greater Flagstaff Regional, but typically our immediate response is going to be Highlands Fire Department and
Which you're saying Highlands would take 7 minutes to get, or is there a station like the one here on Lake Murray Road? Is that like the 7-minute station? I think my overall question is, what if they're busy?
That's a great question.
So, I mean, so then that time, it's more time. What's the next available? Is that 10 minutes? Is that 12 minutes? What does that look like?
Sorry.
Available station. Within 8 minutes.
It does, so if you're already technically a man down, because you don't have the person to coordinate with evacuating the aircraft, so you're already a man down. So you got 2 people in the truck that are spraying the foam. If you could be looking, I mean, you're just hoping that the aircraft personnel can get the passengers off without any assistance from any additional. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I don't want to be dramatic, but yeah, we're rolling the dice. We're trying to do the best we can with what we have.
Well, I feel like I mean, based on the presentations I've already seen, I mean, I almost feel like we're one disaster away from like a something really catastrophic. This is just one, if we have one big incident and then we get another, even kind of a medium incident, like we're kind of screwed. That's the way I'm feeling, for lack of a better way of saying it, like we could not manage 2 incidents at the same time without a higher possibility of loss of life, I would think.
2 large incidents, 2 medium-sized incidents. You're kind of a one significant incident area. To provide an example, the fire that was in Mountain Air that Tim spoke to, where they brought resources. that fire was a single-family dwelling. It became 3 single-family dwellings, and then it became a wildland fire. Which means that everything in northern Arizona was there. Small house fires. That's an example of, limited resources, really.
And I'm just gonna throw this out there. So I work for Taros Mobile Crisis. So I work crisis every day. So I feel like I don't feel like I'm getting all excited about that. I'm just trying to see what it look like, because it almost feels like it's not if it's gonna happen, it's a matter of when something catastrophic like this could happen with our lack of resources. Just the ones that I've already seen presentations on.
I would absolutely agree with that. Yeah, if I'm allowed to agree with that, I'm gonna agree with that. Yeah, we talked about, we'll get to this in a second. I'm gonna try and wrap some of this stuff up. So again, what we're really seeing is we talked about the airport operations, the ARP doing the airport operations is one of the two big issues that we have that causes a bunch of problems. Tell by now what other problem that we have because of our proximity and where we're at is that the ARF is not underneath the branch of the fire department. And so we did a study a couple of years back, and we looked at aircraft or airports of the same size, index, owned by a municipality from the Mississippi West, including Alaska and Hawaii, 5 airports that did that. Ironically, at the time, one of the other airports, the 4th one, was looking at separating the functions because of the very similar same challenges we're talking about now. And we're not the only ones that think about this. Really quick, in 2018, we did a feasibility study, actually piggybacked on a feasibility study with the fire department, looking at these very questions, just thinking, okay, maybe we're crazy. And turns out no. And so their recommendation was, our effectiveness would improve with a single focus on it, and as well as airport operations. Their strategic recommendation was to move the ARF responsibilities to the fire department, which again, typically that's where they're part of. Most recently in 2024, I almost said last year, but I didn't, in 2024, we held a full-scale exercise talking about exactly what you mentioned, the mass casualty.
That's our 7 minutes, by the way. So it's does feel like a long time, especially in the moment.
And Tim's talking, it's like, sorry, 2024 was the largest full-scale exercise in Northern Arizona since 2018. A huge shout out to our city emergency management team for coordinating that and getting it set up. But that looked at a mass casualty incident, and we really saw that in effect in a simulated exercise. In fact, Chief Gaylord, I don't want to put words in your mouth. You, I think, essentially said something that this is our 911 system right now. And so we were really taxed, obviously. But the point is, we had a bunch of people that participated in that from all over the state, anywhere from other airports from Sky Harbor to, Yuma. We had firefighters from Navajo Nation, firefighters from, the region. We had folks from Guardian Air. That on there. And with it, they showed a lot of strengths. Again, it's not all doom and gloom. We showed a lot of good strengths on this out of these full-scale exercises. And I'm just going to paraphrase this, Dan, so don't get mad at me. One of the things that come out of this is something called an after-action review and improvement plan. Ironically, the number 1 and number 2 recommendations in the improvement plan was to separate the ARF and fire functions, and then obviously get more ARF staffing. So again, something we've known about, and we have collectively worked with the fire department, worked with different airport leadership, worked with our city leadership, and kind of collectively agreed this is something that we're trying to do. And so some of the things we've already done to increase this corporation, again, goes back to some of the stuff, same shift, same pay plan, same retirement, same labor union, same minimum standards. Can't overemphasize some of the sameness, if that's a word, same things enough. We've also looked to increase training opportunities, both for the structure folks that are coming out on the airport, get them some sort of training and figure out what that looks like. We've explored cross-training opportunities. There's a little bit of challenges, logistical challenge with that we're still continuing to look at, and overall increasing the interagency operability. So essentially, again, we've developed a plan to move the ARF underneath the fire department, but funding remains the biggest roadblock. And with that, I'm going to give it over to Brian because he knows numbers a lot.
So I mean, that was a lot, right? We covered law enforcement stuff. We've covered our stuff at the airport. We've covered what airport operations looks like, plus what general operations of the airport are doing. So as Tim mentioned, we've worked really hard on some plans over the years to develop some solutions to some of the challenges we've talked about today. So starting with ARF, there's two different primary issues here that we talked about. One is the challenges we've had in the airport funding what we're already doing, right? So that was that first slide I showed in the financial, showing that we were having to rely on additional funds from the general fund to sort of make us whole as an airport. So that's that sort of first column here in the table. Current things we're already doing, this is essentially the services that we've added since we moved to ARF Index B in 2019, right? That was those three additional ARF specialists that Tim talked about. That's moving those personnel to the fire pay plan and making some personnel changes to better align with the Flagstaff Fire Department, plus associated contracts and commodity costs for those personnel and things like that. That's about a shortfall of $522,000. So, we looked at the whole 1.5 million that we're taking from the general fund. Not all of it is ARF. I don't want to paint the picture that the whole thing is public safety funding, but of that, there's about 522,000 that we've added services to increase our responsiveness in recent years that we're struggling to fund. Second is what we really think we should be doing as a result of those studies Tim talked about, what we learned from the after action report, from the major full set exercise we did, which would be basically what we need to do to be able to put the ARF team in a position to combine it with the Flagstaff Fire Department and have it focus exclusively on ARF duties, was the airport supplies a separate operations team that doesn't really involve itself in emergency response. So to meet the minimum staffing from the Flagstaff Fire Department, we would need an additional 3 ARF engineers. We need to do some reclasses and some personnel movement to better, fully realign with what the Flagstaff Fire Department structure looks like, plus those associated contracts and commodities, plus training. So Tim talked about sort of that bench depth, right? Having enough staff to backfill when people are out or assignments. So I'd be increasing that training opportunities, even for folks that maybe aren't always assigned at the ARF station, which would be about another $772,000. So the total we would be hoping to discuss with this team for consideration for funding would be about 1.29, 1.3 million for those 2 needs. And then as the fire department talked about in their presentation in previous weeks, there's this, we're looking at safe staffing, right? That's adding that additional personnel to some of the apparatus in the Flagstaff Fire Department to meet some of those national and regional standards we talked about. So if that was rolled out to the Flagstaff Fire Department and the ARF team was rolled into the Flagstaff Fire Department, that would require an additional 3 personnel at a cost of roughly $448,000. All these costs are the year 1 costs, right? So some of those actually decrease right after, because some of those initial costs are investments in equipment and things like that are sort of a one-time cost that don't fall through. So this is sort of a highest near-term scenario. And as Chief Wilson talked about in his presentation a couple of weeks ago, we will have opportunities to share the spreadsheets that developed all these. So there's really detailed looks at all this, where these numbers came from. We didn't want to put that all up on the screen today for the conversation, but that is going to be available for you to look through to really dig into those numbers. Similarly, from a law enforcement at the airport standpoint, I mentioned that we have the 2 to 3 police officers that are assigned to the airport that were previously supported through some of that grant funding that is no longer in place. So the shortfall we have in that neighborhood is about $350,000. Similarly, we would really like to add some police aides. That's a program that the police department has implemented at other city facilities where they're not police officers, but they do work for the police department and they can provide some of that security service at the airport in those hours when the airport terminal is open, but outside of the hours that the police officers are there currently for departures. That cost would be $307,000. Though I will note that that also includes those startup costs for things like a vehicle and other things like that they would need. So some of those will be used in future years after that initial first year. So that first year cost would be $657,000. So the combined between those two, roughly 1.3 million for that sort of base ask for the ARF team, and 650,000 for law enforcement services at the airport. So in many ways, from an airport perspective, we feel like this is a little bit of a fork in the road for us, right? We've been, as Tim mentioned, we've done a lot of things to try to improve the way we do things at the airport, improve our responsiveness to various types of emergencies, whether that's from the law enforcement side or from the aircraft rescue and firefighting side. But we've sort of run into some challenges based on the resources we have available at this time. So if we find a way to secure that funding that addresses those current and ongoing operational needs that Tim talked about, the challenges we face, the airport public safety staff a dedicated focus on that rather than the split focus between some operational duties and that public safety focus. provides a good level of emergency response to the airport that we think is appropriate for an airport our size. Hopefully it'll increase our employee retention, as that's been one of our biggest challenges and one of the biggest problems that we're trying to solve. Also, from a city standpoint, it consolidates all the fire suppression employees in the city under one organization rather than having them split into two, being the fire department and the airport, and makes us a lot more effective and safe as an airport. Now, if we don't find a way to secure that funding, I think that the challenges we're seeing are, rather than persisting, are probably going to compound. As we talked about some of those challenges with our operating and maintenance costs, those increasing federal requirements. I think this is going to get harder before it gets easier, which is why we're after finding ways to solve this. Similarly, having those two different groups of fire suppression employees across the city is going to continue to be a challenge for morale, for personnel retention, really for organization across the city. And having that focus between aircraft rescue and firefighting and airport operations is going to continue to be a detriment to, I think, both of those duties that we have to fulfill at the airport and the requirements that we have. I know that was a lot that we went through today. I think we still have quite a bit of time left for questions. We covered a lot of ground, from everything from what the airport is and how it operates to how we respond to emergencies. So I wanted to really give the group a lot of time to respond. We have a lot of resources in the room, so if anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
You know, some of this is a function of our inability over the last 30 or 40 years to stimulate economic development there at the airport. We have a lot of land there. Terrible process of trying to secure development would actually help offset some of this cost. Okay, so kind of like we're trying now to put all of this on the onus of the taxpayer because we have failed over here as a city, as a community. So my question is, what are we doing about that? What are we doing to stimulate development there at the airport to make up some of this shortfall?
Yeah, so the big thing is, we talked about that revenue slide, right? The 31.45 acre development is the tech park across the street from you. That's the biggest single piece of developable property we have available. It was signed a lease about a year ago. They have a 4-year period to start developing that site before they are obligated to start paying the city. And it's sort of an amortized schedule where there's a reduced fee up front and kind of make it up on the back end with interest. So that's already in progress, right? They're working on the development application. They've identified a potential anchor tenant. That's a big thing, right? But those are not instant, right? None of those are dollars we're going to see next year or 2 years from now, or potentially even 5 years from now before it really starts to build up. Development, we've had a lot of interest from folks that want to build private hangars at the airport, but they've been very upfront with us. The cost of construction is very high right now, right? So most of those tenants are looking for 40-year leases. They're not planning on making any profit for the first 20 of that. So they're asking for very low rates for the first, couple decades of that development. So we have a lot of irons in the fire. We've hired a consultant, or we actually met with 3 consultants. We're narrowing it down to the one we're going to hire. We're going to develop a rate study. Some of that comes to, we talked about the federal programs that we're obligated to follow. There's a couple things. The FAA, number one, wants us to be as financially self-sufficient as possible, which means, yes, lease that space you have. Number two, it says that for on-airfield development, meaning the things that are sort of in and around our perimeter fence, it has to be aeronautical use. We can't use it for non-aeronautical use. The land that we're on at the Flagstaff Airport was given to the city by the FAA for the purpose of building an airport, right? So it has to be aeronautical. Then number three is we can't charge anything other than fair and reasonable fees for aeronautical purposes. Have to go through a rate study to meet the FAA's selected methodology to show that we're charging those fair and reasonable rates. Essentially, we're sort of capped on how much we can charge. There's a lot of federal oversight into what we can charge for those things. So I guess that's a long way of saying those things are in process right now. We've started a bunch of those in the last 2 to 3 years. They're not a super fast process. But what I would point to is if you look at that economic impact analysis, the airport is generating a lot of economic activity. And a lot of that is coming back to the community, and a lot of it is coming back to the city. It's just not coming back to the airport right now. So I feel comfortable in saying that the funding that the airport is generating for the community of Flagstaff is considerably larger than what we're asking from either the general fund or through other funding mechanisms. Right? I think that if you look at that economic growth, or economic development that's already happened there, it's a big number, right? It's considerably more than what our annual operating budget is. And what I would say is if you look at regional airports across the country, it is not super common for them to be 100% financially self-sufficient. Of course, we would like to be much closer than we are right now, but it is a bit of a heavy lift to get all the way there. But I think it really comes back to, number one, those off-airport developments on airport property that aren't under the requirements of those FAA rules I talked about. So having that tech park development across the street is going to be huge. Opening up the other property we have available for those aeronautical focused developments that want to come in and invest here is another thing that's going to be big. And that's one that are both already in process. Outside of that, the remaining property in the airport is open for development. It's identified in our master plan for future aeronautical use, things like hangars, aeronautical related businesses. But because of its geography, it's isolated, sort of cut off by Forest Service property. There's no access to it. There's no utilities to it. We're not exempt from the resource protection overlay, for example, in the city of Flagstaff. So we have to protect a certain amount of tree resources and steep slope resources. The development costs are very high. And that is so far somewhat limited the interest we've had from private entities that come in to want to develop there just because those startup costs are high and because we can't sell the property since it was given to the city as a grant to build an airport. It's going to be a long time before their initial investment, some of those aeronautical developments.
Yeah, well, you know, having said that, action issue. Trust me, we've been arguing this for 40 years. So this is nothing new. But now there seems to be some movement on the part of the city to relax some of that when it comes to residential development. Because of the whole wildfire issue that has come up. We start having that conversation with the city about relaxing that resource protection issue as it relates to the airport to help facilitate maybe some development and lower those costs of development.
To the resource protection plan?
Yeah.
I think that's ahead of us. We're getting closer. The community is very open to new information, new science that's available that tells us that we need to do something different with respect to protecting ourselves from wildland fire moving through the community. And one of them is we need to revisit the resource protection plan. There's more information. We can do it smarter. We can absolutely make it more advantageous to the development community. And we have started a pilot program. We've got, I believe, and we'll be able to really expand this next month when we bring wildfire management in and talk about wildfire management and insurance. We'll be able to talk a little bit more about that, but I think that's ahead of us. There's a good political support, you know, carefully moving in this direction because there's a lot of folks that have information that tells them that the resource protection plan as it was envisioned years ago when it was put in place was correct. Some new information that allows us to start that community conversation about, we think there's a lot of good reasons in the public safety realm and in the conservation realm that says we should be changing that. So it's en route. We're piloting. I think we have, and we'll speak to wildfire management folks here, but we've identified pilot programs. I think it's just natural for us to start looking at multifamily, commercial, industrial uses as well. It's on the way.
Resource protection overlay requires tree. It's already less than it is for residential. Makes sense.
No, I get that. I'm just saying, you know, with a lot of these things that we've done respect over the last 40 years, it's all these unintended consequences that we're trying now to fix, you know, and it seems like the way we're fixing it is by asking the taxpayer to pay more money. Seems to be the simplest and easiest way to fix it, rather than just addressing the root cause of some of these issues. Now, I'm not saying that we have to get rid of the resource protection. That's not what I'm saying at all. But, you know, the pilot program, we're talking about a 3-year pilot program or so. You know, that's time. I mean, that's a lot of time. And it's hard for me to understand why we have to undergo through that lengthy period of time to get to someplace where we all think we're gonna wind up anyway, okay? Because it makes sense. I mean, it just makes sense to do that. So it's hard for me to understand why we're not doing that like right now. I mean, why is it so hard?
Well, I can address some of that too.
Well, I'm sure you can.
Yeah. Because I've sat down and talked to the wildland fire folks. There's a reason for it. It's more than just reducing the number of trees that have to be left. It's how that whole process works, using LiDAR and et cetera, and working with the landowner. So it's more complicated than just changing the number. Yeah, and so I think there's gonna be a lot of good information to move on and consider at the end of 2.5 more years.
We'll see.
I think.
I'm skeptical.
I know, but it's easy to be skeptical. I think of it as more as where the city is moving toward changing resource protection overlay. And that's good, but it was not an exact answer right now, but it's coming. And that's pretty good after 40 years of keeping it the same.
How you look at it. 40 years is a lot of time.
It is, but the
lot of time.
city did a really good analysis. Hired a consultant, to look at all that was happening in all the other western cities, resource protection. It's really, I mean, I think they're doing a really strong job, so that will make it stand up better out in a final. That's just my opinion, that, you know,
Yeah.
everything takes time.
Well, trust me, I know.
I had a question. Ryan, can you confirm then that the funding request, I like all the detail you provided there. Will that make or not make the airport self-reliant?
It will not fully make the airport self-reliant, but it has a narrow focus on the public safety aspect, right? So there are other parts of the airport, maintenance and operations standpoint, that we weren't going to bring up to this group because it was outside the scope of this committee, right? And that's where a lot of that other work comes in, right? So we have a lot of needs across the airport. We talked about our current operating budget and the deficit we've had in that doesn't incorporate the unfunded priorities we've had, over $4.5 million in unfunded maintenance project needs that we currently have out there. So those, we have other parallel efforts going. That's that increased development, that's the increased economic activity at the airport through things like our upgraded food and beverage systems in the terminal, which make us actually about 4 times more than our restaurant ever did. So like, we're moving in that direction. We've added the badging fees, parking rates. We're going to be coming back for potentially some other user fees at the airport to try to help us in that deficit. We're really taking a very wide focused approach on that to try to sort of attack that from a bunch of different angles. So the focus of today's presentation in terms of those numbers is really on the public safety aspect of that deficit rather than the whole deficit.
Thanks for that.
Can I ask you a question about the parking fees? Sure. Yeah, I've been to the airport. I don't go there a lot, but I've been there 2 or 3 times in the last couple of months, 2 or 3 months. And I parked. I get the little ticket. I go in to pick up whoever I'm there to pick up. I've never had to pay.
First hour's free. So
It depends. If you're there more than an hour, then you get charged.
hours free and the system's set up to know that when cars arrive and depart, so it doesn't make you stop at the exit if it detects that you've been there less than an hour. So yeah, first hour is free, then it's $2 an hour after that up until whatever the daily rate is. There's a different daily rate for the economy lot and the terminal lot, with the economy lot being a little bit cheaper. And we've actually added there's a weekly rate discount, and now we've added a monthly rate discount, which was in response to our business community. So we did raise the daily rates and the weekly rates. We've added a discounted monthly rate for folks that maybe want to leave a vehicle there for their business. If they have a lot of visitors coming in and out, for example, which is something we've heard from folks. And that's actually something we're looking at doing is, since we do have enough parking right now, is potentially adding a permit system for even folks that aren't flying out. Somebody just needs a place to park. maybe for the on-street parking ordinance, winter parking ordinance, if they need a place to store another vehicle, we're hoping to be that outlet for them if they need one through the winter months.
Good. Any other questions from the committee? Anybody online? Like to ask questions of Brian or Tim? Someone here?
Couple questions. Kind of increased revenue you think we'd get by getting other carriers start coming back here?
That's a great question. And the answer is going to be, unfortunately, it depends, right? But some of that has to do with, number one, a new air carrier, a second air carrier is really the largest single thing we can do from a revenue standpoint because it trickles down through all aspects of the airport, right? So if you get an air carrier, number one, we get the rent from that air carrier, the space, the money they pay to operate in the terminal. Number two, we get the landing fees that they pay to bring their aircraft in. It's a certain fee per the weight of the aircraft that they bring in. Then they bring in more passengers, right? And those passengers rent cars. So we get a percentage of the fee from the car rentals. Or if you're flying out because there's more flights available, we get the parking sales from that. So it really does trickle all the way down. The reason it depends is because air carriers, the air service industry is very competitive right now. They're generally going to cities that compensate them and cover their initial startup costs. We're prohibited by FAA rules from using airport revenue to do that, meaning we can't pay them to come here. What we can do is offset some of their initial costs to try to encourage them to come here. So that'd be, I mentioned rent. Well, we might end up waiving their rent for a few years to some footing to try to develop their business model into a successful long-term strategy. We might waive their landing fees, for example. We might help them with some advertising dollars, meaning we might try to say, if they're flying to Denver again, like we had previously, we might do an advertising campaign in Denver, try to encourage folks to take that flight so that we can, make that a successful long-term route. The other challenge is that different air carriers have different schedules, right? So if you talk to a sort of a traditional legacy carrier, Americans, Uniteds, Deltas, they like to fly at least once a day, sometimes 2 to 3 times a day for a new route like Flagstaff. If we were to talk to someone like a budget carrier, Breeze or Allegiant, or even a Southwest in some cases, they fly what's called less than daily, right? They might only come in twice a week on a larger aircraft. In those instances, they might look for reduced rent because they only want to use the space 2 days out of 7. They don't want to pay 7 days worth of rent for a place they're only going to use twice a week. So the answer is, I think the big answer is it will increase our revenues considerably, but by how much and how soon depends on the specifics of the air carrier that might come to Flagstaff. Yeah, we met with 12 air carriers last year, which is a record for us. There's been a lot of interest in Flagstaff from a lot of different carriers. There's a few things that have challenged that. Number one, as I mentioned, that pilot shortage. So airlines are coming out of a pilot shortage. It's getting better than it was, but it's still much worse than it was 10 years ago. Right? There's some federal regulations that went into that and hiring freezes during COVID that we're still seeing the ripple effects of. That's going to be sort of a long-term fix that's kind of stifled growth a little bit. The other is an aircraft delivery shortage. We've heard the news is covered. There's been some aircraft that have had some trouble getting certification through the FAA. Last year, or 2024, I think was the first year that Southwest Airlines ever finished with fewer planes than they started with because they retired planes as they aged out, but were waiting on deliveries of new ones. So that limits the growth those carriers can have. The other thing is they all want those incentives, right? There's a lot of airports competing for a few airlines. Everybody wants more air service, especially now that they're doing that upgauging I talked about. You have fewer airplanes, but bigger airplanes. So there's a increased competition amongst airports to get there. One of the things we're going to be doing is there's a federal program called the Small Community Air Service Development Program. It provides grant funding for airports to try to offset some of the startup costs, and that can be direct revenue guarantees, for example. We're expecting that grant opportunity to come out this year. Or this month. We're going to be applying for it whenever it does come out. I think we have a very strong application this year. Unfortunately, it's very competitive. They can award up to, I think it's $10 million, but last year there was 50 something airports that applied for it. And I think maybe in the neighborhood of 10 received any funding. So it's, you're competing with a lot of airports across the country, but it's something we're working really hard on. We've hired a consultant. We have several staff members that are working not quite full time. As I mentioned, there's only 4 of us in the airport administrative office. So we all kind of wear a lot of hats, but a number of us are making that one of our primary focuses, trying to get additional service.
Firefighters that are being trained, and we're spending a ton of money training these guys to save lives. Why are they doing airport operations in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it goes back to that historic model saying that airport operations had a very low focus, right? As a low barrier to entry. They gave you an ARF truck. They told you how to drive it and, make sure to point the nozzle where the fire is. But unfortunately, over the years, we learned that that's not really enough. So those ARF duties continue to increase. So as Tim mentioned, we're one of the few holdout airports that still has that model, and it's mostly because we haven't found the resources to do anything else, right? We can't have those people focus on ARF until we have enough budget to fund a single focus ARF team and use the resources we have to fund that airport operations team. In some ways, they're two sides of the same coin, right? You can think of ARF in many ways as maintaining the facility to prevent accidents, right? So some of those duties Tim talked about, wildlife hazard management, making sure we don't have wildlife on the field that's not supposed to be there, right? We want to keep birds away. We want to keep coyotes away, things that could be impacted by an aircraft. Sweeping the runways, right, is very much a maintenance duty, but removing those, we call it FOD, foreign object debris, small rocks, bits of debris, pieces of trash that blew in over the fence, making sure that's not in a position that could be ingested by a jet engine and cause catastrophic damage to an aircraft. Things like make sure the markings and lighting are in good shape. So a plane in trouble is coming in a really bad winter storm, they can clearly see where the runway is and put the aircraft down where it needs to be and it's an accident because of low visibility or something. So those are mandates that we can't let drop off.
Stretch so thin, sounds like, that duties that they're trying to do, they're trying to save lives, and we're having them pick up trash. That just doesn't seem right in the way that, could we have less professional people doing jobs like that aren't in the business of saving people's lives?
Could,
Cost less.
if we had enough people to maintain our minimum ARF compliance and have people doing other jobs, which right now we don't. So,
And that's the crux, not to interrupt you, that's the whole crux of what we're trying to, that exact same message. Doesn't make sense in your head. Again, it doesn't make sense on a lot of people. And that's the, what are we doing? And like Brian talked about, it's kind of an evolution of where we came from. Some of that has to do with, like you talked about, some regulations, the impact of the industry and the study of that industry, right? So both airport operations and ARP. And then some of it's been some leadership too. Different leadership in the cities, different leadership at the airport, different leadership at the fire department may have had different or competing. Kind of we're heading or actually past this perfect storm of kind of that's we kind of compared it. We talked about the whole gross or anything, the frog in the boiling water kind of thing. It's been slowly turning up. When somebody comes in and looks at it, wait, what's happening? And what we're trying to address with talking to you folks.
You gentlemen?
Melanie has a question. Go ahead, Melanie.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the conversation and discussion tonight. I just want to make sure I'm tracking the information correctly. So if the ARF was to merge with the fire department, and how might that affect the fire department's budget request? Because I'm looking at the funding request for the airport is FY 27 and 28, and then the one from the fire department that we got in December was more like 20 to 30. So I just want to understand kind of like the relationship that if this funding were available and the merge were to occur, how that might impact the funding that we've been hearing about for the fire department. So appreciate any additional information on that.
Thanks, Melanie. Mark Wilson, Deputy Chief with Flagstaff Fire. Appreciate your question. For the whole group, there are two different, in respect, there are two different requests. What we're talking about is the ARF request that was presented today to make sure that I'm so sorry about my voice, to make sure that the ARF is funded for public safety purposes. The timing of that could be next year. We could move ARF into the fire department next year. The facilities are there, the equipment's there, the personnel could be added to the ARF, and that would allow that to be a merger, if you will, next year from a fiscal standpoint, just contextually. The fire department, we do not have the space to add additional personnel. So that's why when we look at our implementation and our timing, it includes bringing in additional units, including new stations, including other facilities. And so that's why the timelines are a little bit spread out. So Melanie, does that answer your question as to why the two different timelines, they're not competing? They would be a joint purposeful request if you were to look at a merger, but they're independent as they stand today.
Yeah, that's absolutely clear. I think I was just trying to understand if the merger occurred and the request for the fire department is a longer term request, does that merger potentially affect the budget needs that the fire department might experience in that longer time frame?
Yeah, if you look at them independently, they're both needed to make the merger successful.
And Melanie, I mentioned that there are some spreadsheets available that the finance department has developed that will be shared with you. That does show sort of the long-term outlook of the airport rescue and firefighting or aircraft rescue and firefighting requests, which should sort of be added to the requests you've already seen from the fire department.
Great, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have one. So since the city of Flagstaff owns the airport, couldn't airport operations go under some other department like facilities or I don't know, some other department?
I think that's a great question. And I think the answer is certainly it's possible. Right now, we do rely on other city departments for a variety of things. I mentioned the police department is a great example, right? The
Right.
Police department officers come out from a facility standpoint, meaning maintenance in the terminal building. The city facilities team usually comes out and assists us. So the more we do that, the more we pay them. So it's sort of the airport fund pays the city's whatever fund from to help. So while that's true, it would still have an economic cost that I don't think really changes the calculus of this. Because outside of some larger decision that we weren't going to be charged for that, right now, anytime we use resources from other city entities, for the most part, we pay them.
Questions? Let's go. Our next meeting is next Wednesday, January 15th, 30 here, and we're looking at emergency management, is my understanding.
Yes.
Please, same time next week. Drive safely for those of you driving home tonight. Meeting now.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.